like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this brief video. The purpose of today's video is to welcome you to and introduce you to my new website, which I've created specifically for you, my chiropractic patients, and also for your family members and your friends and those people that may be close to you. And the purpose of this website is to share with you an ongoing series of information that I've prepared specifically for you. I know you can get information from a million sources nowadays, but the information that I'm going to present to you is going to be of immediate benefit to you. And I've prepared this information specifically for you because of the concerns that I hear from my chiropractic patients. So I'm going to be addressing some issues that everyone seems to have. And so I'm going to be communicating to you into the future through this website. And you're going to be receiving from me a monthly newsletter. And then in between the newsletters, I'm going to be sending you a series of videotapes on material that I think will benefit you. So make sure to read each of my monthly newsletters and make sure to watch each of the videos that I send to you. They're going to be brief, and I promise not to waste your time, but I promise to present to you information that will be immediately beneficial to you. Also, I have a new email address specifically for chiropractic patients and chiropractic concerns. That email address is perry@carpenterdc.com. So you can send me any questions or concerns that you may have, and I'll respond to you certainly within the same day. And if there's an issue or a topic that you'd like to have me address, let me know what that might be, because I'm certain that if there's something that's of concern to you, it's probably of concern to other people as well. So everyone could possibly and probably benefit by having that issue addressed. So feel free to communicate to me through my new chiropractic website. I want to welcome you to the website. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you use it as a resource into the future. And we're going to begin our very first video topic today, which is all about range of motion. So I'll be back with you in just a moment, and we'll start today's presentation about range of motion. Okay, so what I want to talk to you today about regards range of motion. And you've heard the term range of motion before. And one thing that everyone's concerned about as time goes on and as we age is the loss of range of motion. Now, my chiropractic patients come into me many times and they present with loss of range of motion. But they don't come in and describe it exactly that way. They don't come in and say, "Hey, Dr. Carpenter, I seem to be losing range of motion." They don't say that. Typically in the chiropractic office, you'll hear people say that they feel stiff or that they feel tight. Well, what is stiffness and what is tightness? Well, those are both manifestations of the same thing, and that is that those represent losses of range of motion. So range of motion is something that we want to preserve and that we want to protect as we age, so that we can enjoy pain-free movement and a fully functional and fully active lifestyle as we age. So I want to share with you today some philosophy regarding range of motion, and then I'll give you some practical suggestions that you can use at home to help protect and preserve your range of motion. Now, we're going to be going over a couple of technical terms, so I want to introduce those to you here now. But don't worry, I'm going to keep this lecture on the lay person's level. But there's a couple terms that we need to establish here at the beginning of the video. So I'm going to give you a couple vocabulary words today. The first one of which is going to be the active range of motion, and I'll explain what active range of motion is. The second will be the passive range of motion, and I'll explain what the passive range of motion is. The next vocabulary word that I want to introduce is known as the paraphysiologic space, and I'll describe what that is in a minute. And then finally, we're going to be talking about what's known as the limit of anatomic integrity. And I'll describe each one of those and what those mean to you here as we go. Okay, so let's begin, and let's just keep this simple. Every joint in the body, as you know, has range of motion. And different joints in the body have different ranges of motion. Joints move into flexion, they move into extension. Some joints have rotational movements, like our spine has rotational movements, and every joint in the body moves in at least one plane. Some joints of the body, like the shoulder, move in multiple planes. They're multi-planar joints. So every joint has range of motion, and every joint has at least 3 different ranges of motion. So let's describe those to you now. And you can see here I have a board. I hope you can see it. We're talking today about the philosophy of range of motion. And for illustration purposes, for the purposes of this video, let's talk about the range of motion of the neck. Now, I'll provide specific examples regarding the neck, but the principles that I'm going to share with you today apply to all the joints of the body. But we're going to highlight the movements of the neck for illustration purposes of this video. Okay? So let's begin by drawing a graph here. And we're going to consider the range of motion of the neck, say, in side bending. We're simply considering one motion out of many that the neck has. And this is just to illustrate some of these principles. So let's consider side bending of the neck. This is what's called lateral flexion. And in this case, I'm bending to my left. This would be left lateral flexion of the cervical spine or the neck. Okay? Now, as we begin to move our neck, we can move our neck through a range of motion here, which is called the active range of motion. I hope you can see that. Now, the active range of motion is the amount of motion that I can bend my neck using my own muscles. I'm actively moving my neck. So let me demonstrate that to you. When I lean my neck over like this as far as I can, I'm moving my neck to the limit of the active range of motion. The limit of active range of motion is how far I myself, using my own muscles, can actively move my neck. And the active range of motion eventually comes to a stop, and it has a limit, and we're representing that limit here by this line on this graph. Now, beyond the active range of motion, if you were to come along, or I as a chiropractor or a therapist was to come along and take your neck and move it myself, in other words, if I took your neck and I moved it further beyond your active range of motion, I could move your neck a little bit farther using my hands and getting you to relax. I could move your neck a little bit farther beyond the active range of motion. And we call that space in here, that additional range of motion, we call that the passive range of motion. And I hope you can see that. Okay, so the passive range of motion is a little range of motion slightly beyond that which you can move your neck yourself. So if we had another person here, we could demonstrate this. I would bend my neck as far as I could using the active range of motion. And then another person could come along and using their hands, they could bend my neck a little bit farther to the limit of the passive range of motion, which is indicated by this line here. Now, beyond the passive range of motion, and we'll use a different color pen here, beyond the passive range of motion, we come to the limit of the allowable range of motion of the joint, and we call this end limit. We call this the limit of anatomic integrity. I'll just use the word here, integrity, and I hope you can see that. Now, the limit of anatomic integrity is how far that joint will bend before going too far. What do we mean by going too far? Well, when we pass the limit of anatomic integrity, that's where we suffer injury, and we would call that, in the clinical practice, we would call that a neck sprain. When I move my neck beyond the limit of anatomic integrity, the reason it goes beyond that limit is because there's damage to tissue, and that damaged tissue fails to restrain the neck, and the neck dips into a range of motion where it doesn't belong. So if you've ever sprained your ankle or sprained your wrist, if you've ever dislocated your shoulder, if you've ever fractured a bone, it's because that structure has gone into a range of motion beyond the limit of anatomic integrity, and that's not something that we want to do. Okay? Now here's what's fascinating. This space here, this space in between the end of passive range of motion here and the limit of anatomic integrity here, this space here we call the paraphysiologic, I'll just use the word paraphys, we call that the paraphysiologic space. This is the paraphysiologic space. What the paraphysiologic space is, it's a narrow part of a range of motion slightly beyond the limit of passive range of motion here, but before the limit of anatomic integrity where injury would occur down in here. And the paraphysiologic space is where a chiropractic adjustment takes place. Now I want you to think back to the last time you came in to see me and we did a chiropractic adjustment on your neck. So you'll remember that when we do that, we position your neck to the limit of passive range of motion. I take it over as far as it will go through the passive range of motion. And then I apply a little extra pressure to push the neck into the paraphysiologic space, but not too far. Not too far to the limit of anatomic integrity, but it's the skill of a chiropractor to dip into this little space known as the paraphysiologic space. And when we perform a successful chiropractic adjustment, we increase the range of motion by taking the neck and freeing it up and loosening it up all the way to its limit of anatomic integrity, so that this new range of motion opens up and becomes available to you so you can go through your activities of daily living loosely, freely, and without pain and without restriction. So that's the beauty of a chiropractic adjustment, is a chiropractic adjustment frees up and makes available this additional range of motion that before was unavailable and inaccessible to you. So my job as a chiropractor, in terms of helping you preserve your range of motion, is to free up range of motion that you could not access yourself by way of a chiropractic adjustment, by dipping into the paraphysiologic space and shifting, which then shifts the limit of passive range of motion than closer to the limit of anatomic integrity, and shifts the active range of motion closer than it was before towards the limit of anatomic integrity. So that's the role of a chiropractor, and that's what I do for you when you come in. Now there's a couple things that I want you to do that will help you preserve your range of motion and that will help us together to keep you loose, flexible, and free throughout the course of your life. So we'll get to that here in our next scene. So let's review. So we have our three ranges of motion. We have active range of motion, we have passive range of motion, we have a little tiny range of motion beyond that, which we call the paraphysiologic motion or the paraphysiologic space, and then we reach the limit of anatomic integrity. Now it's interesting because as we age, this whole graph tends to shift this direction towards shorter and shorter ranges of motion. When we're young, this graph shifts down here with large active range of motion, large passive range of motion, and a large limit of anatomic integrity. That's why we say that young people are so flexible. These are the types of terms that we use on a lay basis. We say that young people are soft, they're supple, they're flexible. Some people are what we call double jointed, meaning that they have large ranges of motion of their joints. Now as we age, and if you do nothing to preserve range of motion, what's going to happen is this graph shifts this way, such that we end up with a much smaller active range of motion, a much smaller passive range of motion, and we reach the limit of anatomic integrity sooner and sooner and sooner. And people will simply describe this as I feel stiff, or I feel tight, or my shoulder won't move in that direction, or I'm bound up, or something's locked. These are all typical descriptors of loss of range of motion, and that's something that we want to prevent. So I want to encourage you to help me by being as active as you can within the active range of motion, which we'll just diagram like this here. I want you, and I want to give you some exercises that you can use to fully use the limit of active range of motion. My job is to handle the passive range of motion, and my job is to work in the paraphysiologic space to free up this additional range of motion, but I need your help to use the active range of motion till its fullest extent so that we don't lose it. You've heard the expression, if you don't use it, you lose it. So of course that applies to range of motion along with everything else. So what can you do? Well, I want to give you some exercises that you can use to help preserve and protect the active range of motion. So if we're talking about the neck, for example, what you can do is you can take your neck through the 6 normal ranges of motion that the neck is fully capable of doing. So let me demonstrate those to you. Let's talk about the neck. The neck has 6 ranges of motion, and actively we can exercise the neck through those 6 ranges of motion. So the first one would be right side rotation. So I take right rotation to the limit of the end of active range of motion. So that would look like this. See, this is as far as I can take it using my own muscles. I just can't can't take it any further. That's the limit of active range of motion in right rotation. In left rotation, here's the limit of active range of motion. So what you want to do is you want to take it all the way to the end of active range of motion and apply some pressure with your muscles and try to increase that end point of the limit of active range of motion. So that would look like this. I take it as far as I can, and now I really try and take it a little further, little further, little further, little further, pushing the limit of the active range of motion. In this direction, take it as far as I can, and I pull it, and I pull it, and I pull it. And each time I do, I get a little bit more, a little bit more. Fully working the neck through the limit of the active range of motion. So that's two movements. We did right rotation and left rotation. Let's do side bending. Side bending would look like this. I let it go over as far as it'll go, and then using my muscles on this side of the neck, I pull it, I pull it, I pull it. And then in this direction, I let it go as far as it can go, and then I pull it, I pull it, and I pull it, and I pull it. And each time I get little tiny extra movements out of the neck, exercising the neck through its entire range of the active range of motion. And then we would add in neck extension, and we would add in neck flexion, taking it through the extreme of active range of motion. Now we can take this even a little bit farther to help increase range of motion. How could we do that? Well, we could be our own therapist, and we could help ourselves to get into some of this extra range of motion here, known as the passive range of motion. A little bit of extra new range of motion. How would that look? Well, if I wanted to increase the range of motion of my neck, I would take it all the way to the limit of the active range of motion, and this is left rotation. So I would take it as far as I can, and then I could apply a little overpressure. To take it a little further in this direction, and let me demonstrate it by going this way. See, I take it to the end of active range of motion, it's right about there, and then I apply a little extra to get additional range of motion by dipping into the passive range of motion. It's this added hand that allows me to dip in to the passive range of motion. Now you want to do this very carefully and very slowly, because as you dip into the passive range of motion, you approach the limit of anatomic integrity, and that's not somewhere where we want to go. But you can work in the beginning portion of the passive range of motion here by simply applying a little overpressure. So that would look like this perhaps. A little tiny overpressure to go slightly beyond that which you can do actively. Okay? So what about some other ideas? Well, you can do this for your shoulders as well. Let me demonstrate that to you. If I wanted to stretch out my shoulder and preserve range of motion, I could do a stretch like this. Now notice, in this direction, this is as far as I can go actively. Look, I'm pushing as far as I can. I can't get my elbow any further over that way. But passively, using my own hand, I can bring that shoulder much further into a new range of motion that then helps open up this range of motion so that now when I go to do it actively, notice I can go a little farther. It's the passive assist that helps open up new active range of motion. Isn't that fascinating? This is all about the philosophy of range of motion and how you can help yourself and how you can help me to help you as well. So, what else can we do? For our shoulder, notice here, as I bring my elbow up this direction, this is as far back as I can get my elbow actively. But if I use my head and my hand to lean back on my shoulder, I can get increased range of motion of my shoulder in extension. And really the ideas on this are endless. So I want to conclude this video by simply leaving you with the idea that range of motion is critical. We need to preserve and to protect our range of motion because our movement is vital, and we need to constantly strive to maintain and retain our youthful movement. So range of motion is a primary focus. So you can do some things on your own to help promote range of motion by exercising yourself through active ranges of motion, and then secondarily by applying gentle overpressures in order to go into the passive ranges of motion. And this will help protect and preserve the limit of youthful range of motion for you. And then my job as a chiropractor is to make sure that your joints stay functional and healthy all the way to the limit of the anatomic integrity, and making sure that the limit of anatomic integrity remains a wide and open limit and does not diminish over time with the natural degenerative process of aging. So I hope these ideas are helpful to you. This is Dr. Perry Carpenter. Look forward to being with you on future videos. And of course, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to email me at perry@perrycarpenterdc.com, and I'll get back to you right away. Okay, so this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. Look forward to being with you again, and I hope you have a happy and healthy rest of your day.